classes now in Session 9 Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing some third quarter grades for the San Jose Sharks players. I would have liked to do this after Game 62, but that was the trade deadline day, and as we know, there was a few other things to talk about when it came to the San Jose Sharks during that time, and so instead I've waited after Game 63 here to create a 22-game quarter for this third part of the season. And it's been a bit of a tale of 2 years for the San Jose Sharks over this quarter. It comprises a handful of games prior to the All-Star break and then every game since they returned from that. And in the time before the All-Star break, the Sharks actually looked pretty decent. They were playing some good hockey. They were actually winning some games. In fact, it comprised their first ever shutout of this season, which was interesting to see against the Seattle Kraken. But ever since returning from that 2 weeks off, the Sharks have been pretty bad. They've only won 2 games, one against the Calgary Flames, which was honestly kind of lucky, and then recently a couple of days ago against the Ottawa Senators. But otherwise, it's been loss after loss after loss. It has comprised a 9-game losing streak that only just barely avoided hitting double digits for the third time this season. And so generally the quarter hasn't necessarily treated a lot of these players all that well, and so the grades have been slightly deflated from what was otherwise an extremely promising start to it. And let us immediately start off with, of course, the very important clause to, as per usual, give to these types of videos when it comes to my grading scheme. It is not based on how good these players are in a vacuum, but instead based on how their expectations were and how they have managed to live up to that. For instance, taking a look at an example here on the board, I do not think that Justin Bailey is a better player than Nico Sturm just because he has a better rating than him, just that Nico Sturm had higher expectations than Bailey, and Bailey has done a slightly better job at meeting and exceeding those expectations. So starting off, we have Henry Thrun, and Thrun had a fantastic start to this quarter. He was one of, if not the best defenseman for the San Jose Sharks over the first few games, and primarily in the time before the All-Star break. Unfortunately for Thrun, even though that was a very high level of play that he was reaching, he would get injured in the last couple of games before the break, and once he would return from said injury, he became significantly more inconsistent in his level of play. At times, he would still be pretty serviceable, no, not as good as he was prior to the All-Star break, but in other games, he would be kind of bad and just generally a liability at times for the San Jose Sharks. And so while his grade was very high at first, it has deflated considerably since that starting point, still being a positive, as I still think Thrun was good enough during this quarter, but not nearly as high as you would think. So it saw a slight improvement from C+ to hit a B-. Next, we have Kyle Burroughs. Now, Burroughs, in the earlier parts of the season, was played relatively frequently in the Sharks' top 2 defensive pairings, and even on the top pairing with a player like Mario Ferraro. Over this quarter, he's found himself much more of a home on the third pairing, which is originally what the Sharks brought him in to do. Besides the last game against the Senators where he was put with Mario Ferraro, he was usually with either a Hutchuk on the third pairing or with Kalen Addison on the third pairing, and that's, like I said, where he belongs, where he was doing a decent job. Obviously, it's not a high level of defensive play. He's not particularly good here, and for an actual NHL team, Burroughs would be a 7th or 8th defenseman at best, but for a San Jose Sharks squad that finds them second last in the league in comparison to some of the other defensemen that the San Jose Sharks have, he's been doing decent enough to get a grade of a C, better than what he had last quarter, which was disastrous for him, with a D. Then we get to Nico Sturm. Sturm's a bit of an interesting player to evaluate because there are a lot of good things that he brings to the table and a lot of bad things that just haven't really been living up to expectations. So start with the good. Defensively, he's still relatively responsible, and we also have to talk about his success at the face-off draw. David Quinn frequently this season has been sending Nico Sturm out for shifts to literally just take the face-off and then 5 seconds later go to the bench and change. This is something you rarely see most teams do, but the Sharks have not really many great face-off options, and so Nico Sturm is the guy, and he's been rewarding David Quinn with his performance 60% on the draw, or very close to 60% on the draw this season. That is a major positive. But when it comes to the negatives, Nico Sturm from an offensive perspective has not been nearly as good as he was last season, and that can be explained by the general drop in offensive performance for the Sharks this season, but not this much of a drop, as Sturm is much lower than what he was last year. On top of that, even in the games during this quarter in which Sturm has actually been on a successful line, usually like the third line, players with like Eklund and such at times, he's never really been that driving force. It always feels as though he's playing backseat to his two wingers who are actually doing a lot of the offensive lifting, and Nico Sturm's just kind of there. So that has been slightly disappointing to see. And also, the Sharks' penalty kill this season has been really bad, but over this particular quarter, it has been exceptionally bad, and Nico Sturm plays a sizable role on that penalty kill. And while I would say he's slightly better than others, who I will talk about a bit later, he's still not all that great thus far this season, and as such, he ends up with still a slight positive, but a C+. Then we get to Luke Kunin. Now, Kunin was awful. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. He only just barely evaded getting the grade of an F last quarter. This quarter, he has been better. There have been more games in which I've thought Kunin has looked okay in, but he's found himself frequently on the second line thus far through these 22 games, and he's very rarely actually putting up points and being an effective player. He's been an okay complement for Eklund and Zadina, who have been his frequent line mates over these last few games, but he's never really been that standout player. He very rarely actually has a great game or even a good game. And on the other side of the coin, Luke Kunin has some of the worst possession numbers on the San Jose Sharks, if not the worst for forwards here. So defensively, he's not doing a very good job. He also plays a decent part on the penalty kill, and he was even worse than Nico Sturm thus far this season. And so generally, he ends up with a slightly better but still pretty bad D+. Then we get to Filip Zadina here. Zadina has been a lot better as of late for sure. In the previous quarter, he ended up getting a C-, which was maybe even slightly kind for Zadina, but it was mostly because he's playing in a fourth line role, and it's hard to really look all that terrible in that position. He started off in a similar role. He's actually one of the very few players who got better after the All-Star break. That's probably like the only one, it feels like, who got better after the All-Star break. But prior to that, he was playing on the fourth line, getting like less than 10 minutes a night, not exactly doing too much, but then he managed to find himself up onto the third line after the break, doing some good things, got a 4-point game against the Calgary Flames, jumped up to the second line, and while his offense has shrunk down a bit, kind of expectedly, now playing in a top 6 role against really strong players, you're not going to have as much success, but he still looked relatively decent over many of the games he has played, and as such, he gets the grade of a B-. Then we get to Fabian Zetterlund. Zetterlund is a player who should be in the middle 6 for a team, and yet has been tasked with playing top line for the San Jose Sharks just due to a lack of a better options. And I think Zetterlund is certainly doing his best to try and have success in this particular role. He's put up a decent amount of points over this time, 13 points. He's played every single game of the quarter. In fact, he's played every single game of the entire season thus far for the San Jose Sharks. But a good chunk of the points that he has gotten have come on the power play. At even strength, he has struggled somewhat, and defensively, he has also struggled somewhat. But another good thing for him when it comes to actually the penalty kill, he plays a decent role, not as big as others, but a decent role in the penalty kill. And he's actually been one of the better penalty killing forwards for the San Jose Sharks thus far this season, so that's also a bit of a feather in his cap. You also do have to give credit, while obviously a lot of his points being on the power play and not much being on even strength isn't great, it does mean that the Sharks power play is rolling, which it absolutely has been, especially over the most recent parts of the quarter. And Zetterlund is absolutely a big part of that. He still feels like a really kind of a player who always gives it his all every single shift. You got to give some points there, and as such, he ends up getting the grade of a B, similar to last quarter. Then we get to Ryan Carpenter, not the most exciting player to evaluate. He has become the very consistent fourth line center for the San Jose Sharks. He's been played in that role almost every single game thus far this season, only occasionally getting bumped up to the third line if there's been some injuries or some substitutions of that nature. Carpenter, I do think, has been slightly better than the previous quarter, more so just because the fourth line has been slightly better, and as such, he ends up with the grade of a B-. Then we get to Mackenzie Blackwood, the only goaltender on this list due to the fact that Kähkönen was dealt at the trade deadline to the New Jersey Devils. Blackwood has not played a ton of games, or at least not started a ton of games thus far in this quarter, the 22 games, because of the fact that he's been injured a couple of times. Currently, he's on IR, but he was also briefly injured earlier on, and so Kähkönen was getting the majority majority of the starts during this stretch of 22 games. But in the games that Blackwood did start, he had immense success, in particular prior to the All-Star break. He actually got that shutout that I mentioned, the Seattle Kraken shutout. That was the only shutout of the season for the San Jose Sharks, and he's been mostly very, very solid in all of the outings he had, bar one of them. He has a positive record. I think it's 5-2-1 over this stretch, so you obviously can't give all that negative a grade. The only reason he falls slightly is because of the small sample size. 8 games over 22, that's not really all that much, and so I'm not going to give him like a very high estimation A+, but he still gets a solid A-. Then we get to Calen Addison. There was slight improvement for Addison. He was he was actually the only player to get an F in last grade, which was just completely terrible because Addison has been a massive disappointment ever since they acquired him from the Minnesota Wild. This quarter, he's been ever so slightly better. He's had a couple of games from a defensive standpoint where he hasn't been nearly as bad, though he's still been kind of just meh. And then also, it should be noted, he had a couple of games at forward during the stretch where he was decent enough in that particular role. So that does just barely get him over the finish line to evade another F grade and get him to D-, but that's really not all that much better. Then we get to Mario Ferraro. Ferraro is kind of like the heart and soul of this team, not generally from like a locker room perspective, as I don't really have enough knowledge about that to really say that, but more so from an on-ice performance perspective, because Ferraro plays the most ice time out of any player here on the San Jose Sharks by a pretty wide margin, and it feels as though when the San Jose Sharks are playing badly, Ferraro is playing badly. Or I guess it kind of is more like the opposite. If Ferraro is playing badly, the Sharks as a whole are likely playing badly. And if Ferraro is playing well, the Sharks as a whole are likely playing well. And so he kind of just sort of follows the rising tide here of this team. He really leads them in that regard. With Logan Couture being injured for the vast majority of this season, the Sharks have not had a captain. A lot of that has likely fallen onto Mario Ferraro being this big role player for San Jose. And so it's hard to say if he was all that great. It's hard to say if he was all that terrible. I feel as though in the role that he's been playing, he's been decent enough, and as such, for the second straight quarter, he gets a C. Then we get to Marc-Edouard Vlasic. Now, in the previous quarter, Vlasic did not play enough games, primarily due to being a healthy scratch more often than not. He has not been good, but in the time prior to the All-Star break, Vlasic had completely turned it around, showing his best hockey that he has played in many, many years. Vlasic was flying high for those stretch of games, and this wasn't just 1 or 2, this was like 7 or 8 games in a row. Vlasic was looking outstanding in his performance, so that was really impressive to watch. But unfortunately, the Sharks then had that break, 13 days off, and that kind of clipped Vlasic's wings, and when he came back, he was definitely better than what he was in the early parts of this season, but not nearly at the level that he just had been hitting. And so Vlasic's grade does get deflated slightly, but because it had started off so well and the expectations were so low, it still ends up at a pretty good B+. Then we get to Mikael Granlund. Now Granlund, I talked about the heart and soul being Mario Ferraro. Granlund has essentially been the guy carrying the brunt of the offense for the San Jose Sharks for the majority of this quarter, since a lot of the games have happened post All-Star break. There's been no Hurdle, there's been no Logan Couture, and so Granlund has been having to do that. He's the leading scorer on the team. But having said that, kind of like what I mentioned with Fabian Zetterlund, at even strength, it has been a bit of a struggle. He's put up 13 points, but only 5 of them at even strength. He has not played every single game. I believe only 16 of the 22 games in this quarter, but 5 even strength points is just not all that fantastic. And the play-wise of his on-ice performance has kind of followed with that. His even strength performance in so many of these 16 games really hasn't been all that impressive. Defensively, Granlund is heavily relied on by David Quinn. He's played in practically every single situation. You know, the exact same words you would use to describe Logan Couture last season and in many previous seasons for San Jose, you would use to describe Granlund, because if it's a 5-on-3, Granlund's on the ice. If you're defending a 1-goal lead, Granlund's on the ice. But also from an offensive perspective, he's always playing as well. The thing is for Granlund is that defensively, he's not as good as Logan Couture. If you take a look at his penalty killing performance, he's one of the main reasons for why the Sharks' penalty kill is as awful as it is. Granlund's numbers are not very good in this particular role. And so while I do think he's doing a very good job at carrying the offense for San Jose, he's a huge part of the Sharks' power play as of late. and so he'll still get a positive grade, especially since his expectations weren't sky high necessarily. It does definitely keep it slightly lower than what you would expect at that grade of a B. Then we get to Mike Hoffman here. Hoffman has always been a little bit of a weird player to evaluate thus far this season. Very up, very down, has some great games, has some terrible games, and this quarter is absolutely no different from that. I could pick out like 5 or 6 games where Hoffman was straight up the worst forward for the San Jose Sharks that they iced, and then I could pick up 5 or 6 games in which he was like one of the better 3 or 4 forwards. Most recently, Hoffman was really good in the game against the Ottawa Senators, for instance. That's definitely a really good example of an effective Mike Hoffman game. But then you take a look at a few games prior to that, and it was not nearly as good and significantly worse. There was a time where I thought Hoffman should very well be a healthy scratch, even over the likes or under the likes of players like Kevin Labanc or Giovanni Smith. And so with that being said, it kind of ends up averaging out to the grade of a C. Then we get to William Eklund. Now Eklund, he had a very strong start to this quarter. Prior to the All-Star break, when he was played in a much more familiar role, which is on the wing, he was actually having some decent success. David Quinn had actually even dropped him down to the third line to try and sort of open him up to playing against weaker players, and that had worked exceptionally well. Eklund had a very strong stretch of games because of that, even after getting bumped back up to the top 6 at times. The problem is, once he returned from the All-Star break, he was tasked with playing the center position due to the injuries of both Hurdle and Couture, and Eklund in that particular role has just not really managed to excel. From a power play perspective, he has been rather good and has been racking up the points in that particular area, but from an even strength perspective, he has struggled not just offensively, but also defensively. He has been one of the highest minus players for the San Jose Sharks over this stretch of 22 games. Most other players are like a -3, a -4, maybe. Some players are even getting close to like a flat out even. Meanwhile, William Eklund is a -13 over this stretch, which is just not very good, even if this stat isn't necessarily the most reliable of stats. One thing in Eklund's favor is that he continues to be one of the most effective, if not the most effective, penalty-killing players for the San Jose Sharks. If you take a look at the stat of power play goals against per 60 minutes, Eklund sits at about 4 power play goals against per 60 minutes of short-handed ice time that he has. The next closest forward to him is Fabian Zetterlund at just under 7 power play goals against. That is a massive difference. It is pretty much a thing that if Eklund is on the ice, it's going to be pretty difficult for the other team to actually score on the power play. The major issue for the San Jose Sharks penalty kill thus far this season is that when anybody else is on the ice, it's actually exceptionally easy for them to score. But when Eklund is there, things are usually relatively locked down. So that's definitely a good thing. But at even strength, his defensive and offensive games just haven't been all that great since that All-Star break, which does bring his grade down to a B-. Then we get to Jan Ruda, a frequent defensive partner for Henry Thrun, and as such, his grade actually matches up with Thrun. Not nearly as high and low, but kind of similar issues to Thrun, where he's just demonstrated a lot of inconsistencies since returning from that large break. He'll make these aggressive pinch plays, which are quite nice to see. He won't have as much dangerous sort of breakout passes that Thrun will go for. He usually plays the very safer play. But from a defensive standpoint, there are times where he's overcommitting. There are times where he's out of position. And so while I do think his prior to the All-Star break was really good, just as it was with Henry Thrun, he ends up still with the grade of a B-. Then we get to Justin Bailey, another kind of fourth line forward that isn't super interesting to evaluate, kind of like Ryan Carpenter. It is quite clear that the Sharks had the expectation, or didn't have many expectations for Justin Bailey coming into this season. He wasn't expected to play really any role with the San Jose Sharks at all. It's kind of a surprise that 63 games into the season he is even on the roster, but he's certainly played well enough to deserve a roster spot, and in fact, over these last few games, even got promoted up to the third line off of the fourth line. His third line output hasn't really been all that great. Here, he probably should go back to the fourth line, where he was actually still finding some relative success. He even had a 3-point game during this quarter, which was nice to see. And so he does end up with a pretty positive grade, but nothing outstanding as you would expect from a fourth line forward. So he gets a B-. And then, of course, we get to Barabanov, the final forward on this list, a player who I didn't think I would end up evaluating just because I thought he would get traded at the deadline. But because he has been so bad this season, he doesn't actually end end up getting moved, and the Sharks are forced to keep him. You take a look at a player like Anthony Duclair, who also wasn't having a ton of success this season, but finished off the last couple of weeks prior to the deadline really strong, which ended up getting the Sharks not only a third-round pick, which is decent enough at the deadline, but also a pretty young and relatively promising young defenseman from the Tampa Bay Lightning. And that was without any salary retained for the for the Tampa Bay Lightning. When it came to Barabanov, even though his contract has come in slightly less than what Duclair is, he needed that contract, some money retained, because he's just been so bad this season that nobody really wants to take the risk of filling out the rest of their cap space for a player of Barabanov's caliber thus far this season. And so once that Tomas Hertl retention slot was used up, Barabanov ends up sticking around, and this quarter was really bad for him once again. The only reason he avoids an F is that he did have a couple of okay standout games. For instance, this most recent one against the Ottawa Senators when he was placed with both Granlund and Zetterlund was decent enough, but clearly not all that high of a level either, and he's been mostly just floating in a lot of the games that he has played over this quarter. It's no wonder he didn't actually end up getting traded, and at this point you're just waiting for him to leave in the offseason because he's just been not good at all comparison to what he was in the previous couple of seasons for San Jose. So that's definitely been disappointing to see. So again, that D- is only just barely avoiding the F, and that's actually slightly worse than what he was last quarter. But that will do it for this grading. Generally, I thought the Sharks looked okay enough throughout this quarter. A lot of the grades are kind of like just barely over C+, or just barely over C, which is like kind of the smack dab average. You've met my expectations. There's nothing spectacular here, but a few players obviously being very disappointing, which is not that much of a surprise to see here for San Jose. Class dismissed.